The world has entered one of those rare moments in history where events appear to be accelerating faster than diplomacy can contain them. Across television screens, social media feeds, and intelligence briefings, the same question is being whispered in capitals from Washington to Moscow, from Tel Aviv to Beijing. Are we standing on the edge of another Middle Eastern war? At the center of this growing anxiety lies Iran, a nation once again engulfed by internal unrest, and the United States, a global power whose relationship with Tehran has been defined for decades by suspicion, confrontation, and unresolved grievances. When former U.S. President Donald Trump issued a blunt warning that Iran could face severe consequences if it continued killing protesters, the remark did not land as ordinary political commentary. It landed like a match tossed near dry fuel. To understand why this warning reverberated so strongly, one must look beyond the headline and examine the deeper forces at play. This is not merely a story about protests, nor is it only about rhetoric. It is about how domestic instability can collide with international power politics, how history shapes perception, and how quickly the line between warning and war can dissolve. Iran's current wave of unrest did not begin with a single event. It is the result of years of accumulating pressure, frustration, and despair. Economic hardship has become a daily reality for millions of Iranians. Inflation has hollowed out salaries, food prices have surged, and the national currency has lost much of its value. For young people, who make up a large portion of the population, unemployment and underemployment have become chronic conditions rather than temporary setbacks. Education no longer guarantees opportunity, and ambition increasingly meets a closed door. While Iranian authorities often attribute these problems to foreign sanctions and hostile powers, many citizens see a deeper, more uncomfortable truth. They see systemic corruption, mismanagement, and a political structure that offers little room for accountability. Over time, this gap between official narratives and lived experience has widened into something far more dangerous than criticism: a loss of faith. In such conditions, protests become inevitable. They are not driven by ideology alone, nor by foreign influence, as authorities often claim, but by exhaustion. Exhaustion with economic insecurity, with restrictions on personal freedoms, and with a political system that appears unresponsive to peaceful demands. When demonstrations began spreading across cities and towns, they reflected a society reaching a breaking point. The state's response followed a familiar pattern. Security forces moved in quickly, using force to disperse crowds, arrest organizers, and suppress the flow of information. Reports emerged of live ammunition being used, of mass detentions, of families searching for loved ones who never returned home. Internet disruptions cut protesters off from the outside world, turning entire neighborhoods into isolated zones of fear and uncertainty. These actions may have temporarily reduced the visibility of protests, but they intensified something far more consequential: international attention. Images and reports crossed borders even when connections were severed, triggering outrage among human rights organizations, foreign governments, and diaspora communities. What had begun as a domestic crisis was now firmly in the global spotlight. It was in this charged atmosphere that Donald Trump issued his warning. To some, it sounded like moral outrage. To others, it sounded like provocation. But to analysts who have studied Trump's record, it sounded like something else entirely: a signal. Trump's presidency fundamentally altered how both allies and adversaries interpreted American behavior. He rejected traditional diplomatic caution in favor of what he called strength and deterrence. His belief was that predictability invited challenge, while uncertainty imposed restraint. By making adversaries unsure of how far he might go, Trump believed he could prevent them from crossing lines in the first place. This approach was not theoretical. It was demonstrated dramatically in January 2020 when the United States carried out a drone strike that killed Qasem Soleimani, one of the most powerful figures in Iran's military and intelligence structure. That strike shocked the world not only because of who was targeted, but because of where and how it happened. It shattered assumptions of restraint and forced Iran to confront a new reality. American red lines under Trump were real, and they could be enforced suddenly. That memory has never faded in Tehran, nor in Washington. It is the unspoken context behind every new threat and counter-threat. When Trump speaks about consequences, Iranian leaders do not hear abstract language, they hear precedent. By linking Iran's internal crackdown to potential international action, Trump reframed the crisis in a way that dramatically raised the stakes. The treatment of protesters was no longer portrayed as an internal matter, but as a trigger for external consequences. This framing resonates powerfully in Western political culture, where human rights violations are often used to justify pressure, sanctions, or even intervention. For Iranian leadership, this framing is deeply infuriating. Officials accuse the United States of hypocrisy, pointing to decades of sanctions that have harmed ordinary Iranians, to military interventions across the region, and to Washington's support for rival powers. They argue that America has no moral authority to lecture anyone on human rights, yet anger does not neutralize risk. When moral language intersects with military capability, escalation becomes more likely, not less. Iran responded in predictable fashion. Officials rejected Trump's remarks outright, accusing Washington of interference and psychological warfare. Military readiness was emphasized, drills were conducted, missile capabilities were showcased. Warnings were issued that any attack on Iranian soil would be met with painful retaliation. This was not just messaging for foreign audiences, but reassurance for domestic ones. In times of unrest, projecting strength becomes a tool of internal control. What makes this moment particularly dangerous is the existing military reality in the region. The United States maintains a vast and sophisticated military presence across the Middle East. Aircraft carriers patrol nearby waters, air bases host advanced strike aircraft, missile defense systems protect allies. Thousands of troops are stationed across multiple countries. This infrastructure means that military action does not require months of preparation. It can be executed quickly, with little warning. Modern conflict rarely begins with formal declarations of war. It begins with precision strikes, cyber operations, and limited actions that can escalate rapidly. From a legal standpoint, a U.S. president has broad authority as commander-in-chief to order such operations, especially when framed as protecting American interests, allies, or global stability. History shows that these decisions are often made under intense pressure, with incomplete information, and with long-term consequences that far outlast the moment. Trump's political personality adds an additional layer of uncertainty. He has consistently emphasized deterrence through strength and unpredictability. Supporters argue that this approach prevents conflict by making the cost of defiance too high. Critics argue that it increases the risk of miscalculation, where one side misreads the other's intentions, or where escalation occurs faster than anyone intended. The potential consequences of a U.S. strike on Iran would be enormous. Iran is not an isolated state with limited reach. It possesses significant missile capabilities and maintains influence through allied groups across Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. Retaliation would not necessarily come in the form of a single direct response. It could unfold across multiple fronts, targeting U.S. aces, regional allies, or critical infrastructure. One of the most sensitive pressure points is the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow waterway through which a substantial portion of the world's oil supply passes. Any disruption there could send energy prices soaring, destabilize markets, and deepen global economic uncertainty. For countries already struggling with inflation and post-pandemic recovery, such a shock would be deeply damaging. International reactions so far have been cautious. Many governments have called for restraint and dialogue, expressing concern over both Iran's crackdown on protesters and the risk of external military intervention. Diplomatic channels remain open, but they are strained. In an environment where rhetoric hardens and military readiness increases, the space for compromise narrows. For ordinary Iranians, the situation is especially tragic. They find themselves caught between a government determined to maintain control and the looming threat of foreign pressure or conflict that could further destabilize their lives. For Americans and people around the world, the possibility of another major Middle Eastern conflict revives fears of prolonged instability, rising costs of living, and shifting global power dynamics. What makes this moment so unsettling is not just the severity of the rhetoric, but the speed at which words can translate. To understand why the world reacts so sharply whenever Donald Trump issues a warning, one must go deeper than policy papers or official statements. The true source of uncertainty lies not only in military capability or legal authority, but in psychology. International politics is often discussed as a chessboard of rational actors, yet history repeatedly shows that personality, perception, and ego can be just as decisive as missiles and armies. In the current U.S.-Iran confrontation, this human element is impossible to ignore. Donald Trump has never governed like a conventional American president. From the moment he entered the political arena, he positioned himself as a disruptor, someone who rejected diplomatic traditions, expert consensus, and long-established norms. In foreign policy, this translated into a worldview where strength mattered more than process and outcomes mattered more than approval. Allies were pressured, adversaries were confronted, and ambiguity became a deliberate strategy. This approach fundamentally altered how both friends and foes interpreted American intentions. Previous U.S. administrations relied heavily on predictability. Red lines were stated cautiously, escalation was gradual, and diplomacy was often prioritized, even when force was used. Trump inverted this logic. He believed that predictability encouraged adversaries to test limits, while unpredictability kept them cautious. By making it unclear how he might respond to provocation, he aimed to deter escalation before it began. In theory, deterrence through uncertainty can work. During the Cold War, both the United States and the Soviet Union relied on the fear of catastrophic retaliation to prevent direct conflict. However, Trump's version of deterrence differed in a crucial way. It was not rooted in mutually understood rules, but in personal decision-making. This meant that foreign leaders were not simply calculating national interests, they were attempting to interpret Trump himself. This is why Iran watches Trump's words so closely. Tehran does not view him as a symbolic figurehead. It views him as a leader capable of acting suddenly, decisively, and without warning. The memory of January 2020 remains central to this perception. The killing of Qasem Soleimani was not only a military action, it was a psychological shock. Soleimani was not a rogue commander or a fringe militant. He was a central pillar of Iran's regional strategy, a man deeply embedded in the state's power structure. By ordering that strike, Trump shattered a long-standing assumption that senior Iranian figures were untouchable. The message was unmistakable. Status and symbolism would not guarantee safety. For Iran's leadership, this was a moment of profound recalibration. Retaliation followed, but it was carefully calibrated to avoid all-out war, revealing the tension between outrage and restraint. That episode exposed both the strength and the danger of Trump's approach. On one hand, it demonstrated American resolve and capability. On the other, it highlighted how quickly escalation could spiral toward disaster. Missiles were fired, bases were targeted, and the region held its breath. A single miscalculation could have triggered a broader conflict, drawing in allies, disrupting global markets, and costing countless lives. This background is essential for understanding why Trump's recent warning regarding Iran's crackdown on protesters carries such weight. When he speaks of consequences, Iranian decision-makers cannot dismiss the statement as campaign rhetoric or moral posturing. They must consider the possibility that it reflects a genuine willingness to act. From Trump's perspective, linking human rights abuses to international consequences serves multiple purposes. Domestically, it reinforces his image as a strong leader, unwilling to tolerate brutality. Internationally, it reframes Iran's internal actions as a threat to global norms and stability. Strategically, it applies pressure at a moment when Iran is already vulnerable due to internal unrest and economic strain. Yet, this strategy also carries significant risks. Deterrence relies not only on fear, but on clarity. Adversaries must understand what actions will trigger a response and what actions will not. Trump's unpredictability blurs these lines. While uncertainty can restrain, it also confuse. Iran may struggle to determine whether restraint will reduce pressure or whether pressure will continue regardless of its behavior. This uncertainty is compounded by Iran's own internal dynamics. The Iranian leadership is not monolithic. It consists of competing factions, power centers, and institutions, including the clerical establishment, the military, and the security apparatus. In times of crisis, these actors do not always agree on the best course of action. Some advocate defiance, others caution. External threats can unify them temporarily, but they can also intensify internal rivalries. When Trump issues a warning, it does not land on a single decision-maker's desk. It ripples through a complex system, influencing debates behind closed doors. Hardliners may argue that backing down invites further pressure, while pragmatists may warn that confrontation risks catastrophe. In such an environment, misinterpretation becomes more likely. Another critical factor is the American political system itself. While Trump emphasizes personal authority, he operates within a broader institutional framework, including Congress, the military, intelligence agencies, and public opinion. However, as commander-in-chief, he retains significant discretion, particularly in the early stages of a crisis. Limited strikes, covert operations, and cyber actions can be authorized rapidly, practically before public debate fully emerges. This reality is not lost on Iran. Iran understands that a U.S. president does not need unanimous approval to act. It also understands that domestic political pressures can incentivize displays of strength, especially during periods of heightened media attention and public outrage. In this sense, Iran's internal protests intersect dangerously with American domestic politics. For Trump, strength is not only a strategic tool, it is a political identity. Throughout his career, he has framed leadership as dominance and compromise as weakness. This worldview shapes how he responds to challenges. A visible crackdown in Iran, coupled with global outrage, creates a narrative environment where inaction could be portrayed as failure. Action, by contrast, reinforces his self-image and political brand. Critics argue that this personalization of foreign policy is inherently dangerous. When decisions are filtered through ego and perception, the margin for error narrows. A leader may feel compelled to act not because it is strategically necessary, but because it aligns with an image they feel must be maintained. In high-stakes environments, such motivations can have irreversible consequences. Iran, for its part, is acutely aware of this dynamic. Its public rhetoric emphasizes resistance and sovereignty, but its strategic calculations are more nuanced. Iranian leaders know that provoking a direct military confrontation with the United States would be devastating. At the same time, appearing weak could undermine their authority domestically and embolden internal dissent. This creates a paradox. To maintain control at home, the regime may escalate repression. To deter foreign intervention, it may escalate rhetoric and military readiness. Each escalation, however, increases the risk of triggering the very intervention it seeks to avoid. This is the trap of brinksmanship, where both sides push closer to the edge in hopes that the other will blink. The broader international community watches this dynamic with growing concern. Allies of the United States worry about being drawn into another regional conflict. Rivals see opportunities to exploit instability. Global markets react nervously to every new development, aware that conflict in the Middle East rarely remains contained. At the heart of this tension lies a fundamental question. Does unpredictability prevent war, or does it make war more likely? Trump's supporters argue that fear of decisive action keeps adversaries in check. His critics argue that fear without clarity invites miscalculation. History offers examples supporting both views, but it also offers a sobering lesson. Wars often begin not because leaders seek them, but because they believe the other side will back down. As Iran's internal unrest continues and international pressure mounts, the psychological battle intensifies. Every statement, every military exercise, every warning becomes part of a larger signaling game. In this game, perception matters more than reality. To understand why the world reacts so sharply whenever Donald Trump issues a warning, one must go deeper than policy papers or official statements. The true source of uncertainty lies not only in military capability or legal authority, but in psychology. International politics is often discussed as a chessboard of rational actors, yet history repeatedly shows that personality, perception, and ego can be just as decisive as missiles and armies. In the current U.S.-Iran confrontation, this human element is impossible to ignore. Donald Trump has never governed like a conventional American president. From the moment he entered the political arena, he positioned himself as a disruptor, someone who rejected diplomatic traditions, expert consensus, and long-established norms. In foreign policy, this translated into a worldview where strength mattered more than process.